We've all done things we're not proud of. Things that were selfish, harmful to ourselves or to others. And most of us have probably also struggled with what to make of that. Do our mistakes make us bad people? Should we feel guilty? And if so, for how long? Or should we be focusing instead on how to make things right? These are questions religion has been wrestling with for millennia, because they go right to the heart of one of our biggest struggles as humans, figuring out how to live with each other and with ourselves. But they can also be some of the most rewarding to explore. A few seasons back, we sat down with writer Elizabeth Oldfield, who made the case that the concept of sin isn't really about condemnation or shame. It can actually be a useful tool for recognizing the ways we fall short and for finding a path back toward living in connection. That can be a powerful lens through which to view our own lives. But when we widen it, a whole other set of questions comes into focus. Why do we fall short in such different ways? And why does it seem to be so much harder for some people to be good than for others? When it comes to moral behavior, we tend to focus a lot on how people were raised and on the individual choices they make. We have a much harder time making sense of how biology and genetics factor into the equation. So on this episode, we're rethinking sin again. This time with the help of Kathryn Paige Harden, professor of psychology and director of the Developmental Behavior Genetics Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. Paige is the author of a new book, Original Sin, on the genetics of vice, the problem of blame, and the future of forgiveness. She and I sat down to discuss religion's influence on modern scientific thinking about harmful behaviors, what genetics can actually tell us about ourselves, and how it should change the way we think about accountability and repair. You can find a full video of our conversation on YouTube at How God Works Pod. I'm Dave DeSteno, and I hope you'll enjoy this special episode of How God Works, the science behind spirituality. So Paige, thank you for joining us. I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and it's just nice to meet you in person.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So to start, and so people can get a better sense of where you're coming from, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the work you do and what led you to write a book about sin, which admittedly isn't a common topic for a scientist to write about.
Yeah. So I'm what's called a behavior geneticist. So I study how our genes affect our behavior. And my background is in clinical psychology. And there's a number of mental disorders, clinical conditions that you might study using genetics. So some people study the genetics of depression. Some people study the genetics of anxiety. What I study are the genetics of disorders that are defined by doing things that might hurt yourself or might hurt other people. So things like addiction or conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder. This is something my lab has done the whole time I've been a faculty member. And especially recently, I've been really prompted to consider, well, we know that genes influence these behaviors. What does that mean for how we treat people after they've done these behaviors? How do we make sense of these scientific results? So the book was really written for myself as an attempt to work through what do I really think about these topics. And now I'm excited to talk about it with other people.
And I know you're talking about maladaptive behaviors or behaviors that we might call antisocial. But the book is titled Original Sin. So before we delve into the science, let's talk a little bit about what that idea of sin means. In the book, you make the point that the way we talk about moral behavior today, even in science, still carries traces of this older religious thinking. Can you walk us through what some of the debates and early ideas were about sin and its sources?
Yeah, so sin is definitely a very Christian way of saying it. I want to back up, though, and point out that you don't have to be Christian. You don't even necessarily have to come from a religious tradition to think about that there are behaviors that people do that we have moral feelings about. We think of them as praiseworthy or blameworthy. We think of them as violating the rules. So I think the idea of what I call in my book lowercase sin, which are actions that contravene, that violate some norm, some rule, everyone has those. So everyone has some sense of thou ought not do some things, even if we don't call it sin. And then in the early Christian church, there was also this idea of what I call in my book, uppercase sin, which is more than just an action that violates a rule. It's a tendency that's inherited that makes you inevitably going to screw things up. So this was Augustine of Hippo. He was a saint in the early Christian church about 400 years after the birth of Christ. And he was really putting forth this idea that someone wasn't just sinning in the action, that humans were sinful, that there was something about our human nature that was inherently bad, and that thing was inherited. So we have in the early Christian church these kind of two competing notions of sin, one being a verb and one being a condition that you inherit.
So that's the idea of original sin. So you're basically born with it, right? I think my understanding was Augustine, one way he came to that was, well, why would a good God let babies suffer?
Yes.
They must have some inherent failure or flaw in them so that they're not totally pure. But there was a competing view, right? What was that?
Yeah. So Augustine's view was that Adam and Eve broke the rules in the garden. God said, don't eat of the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they did it. And then he was trying to figure out, okay, well, they did that. What does that have to do with us? And he came up with this idea that sinfulness was physically inherited. It was physically inherited through the sex act. That's part of why Augustine, in addition to his pre-conversion, very complicated sex life,
had a libertine lifestyle, I think you can say, yes.
He had a lot of complicated views about sex and really advocated no marriage, no sexual intercourse, no sexual activity of any kind, because that was how this inherent sinfulness was passed down from generation to generation. What's interesting to me, especially as someone who was a child growing up in the church, is that Augustine proposed this doctrine of original sin around 400 years after the birth of Christ. So there was several centuries of Christian thought about what sinfulness was before we got this Augustinian notion. And his primary sort of intellectual rival of the time was Pelagius, who was from the opposite end of the Roman Empire. So Augustine was from North Africa. Pelagius was from Britain. He was a monk. And he was really opposed to this idea of inherited sin and really argued that if something was of nature, if something was biological, he wouldn't have said biological, but if something was natural, was part of the natural created world, it couldn't be sinful, that sin had to be a function of your free choice. So you had differing views of free will, and then also differing views of what sin is. Is sin a condition in your body, or is it an act of will? And then also differing views of the relationship between sin and biology. So Augustine saying you can physically inherit sinfulness, and that doesn't get you off the hook. And Pelagius saying nothing that we inherit can be sin. And so if something's inherited, if something's of nature, it can't be sinful. So we had this kind of grand debate in the early Christian church. And Augustine officially won. So
I was going to ask you that. Yeah. What is it about his view that it became the dominant one?
It's really interesting. So Elaine Pagels, who's a scholar of religion, she wrote this book, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent. And it's about the Genesis story and the interpretation of the Genesis story and how that changed over the course of early Christian history. And what she points out in her book is that Augustine was writing at a very unusual juncture historically in the Christian church. So when Christianity was first started, it was very much a religion of slaves, a religion of colonized people. And what it preached to people who were deeply oppressed, deeply colonized, was freedom. That you might not be free from your enslaver, you might not be free from this imperial power, but you could, through baptism, through belief in Jesus Christ, become free in your will. You could be free to choose good and evil. You could be morally free. Some of the Greek that's interpreted as free will is actually freedom to reconstitute one's being, right? And we kind of gloss over that meaning now when we talk about a born-again Christian, but it's a really It is a religion that promises transformation and freedom from the body, right? If you're becoming born again through belief. So that was the political conditions that governed early Christian history. But then in the early 300s, Constantine famously converted to Christianity. So now you have a church that, rather than being an oppressed minority that is bringing a message of freedom, you have a church that is increasingly allied with the most powerful empire in the world, and you have this merger of ecclesiastical and imperial power. And that makes for an interesting condition about the role of freedom as a message there, because what justifies the increasing consolidation of power if by baptism you can become free to choose right from wrong? So Augustine, I'm not saying this is necessarily conscious. I'm not saying he was like, what theory of human nature can I cook up that's going to justify the consolidation of church power? But it is very convenient that at a time where the church was becoming more powerful through its allyship with the Roman imperial project, Augustine was coming up with a view of human nature that said, you can never really be free to choose good from evil. You will always be corrupted. You will always be depraved. Your individual conscience can never really be trusted. And so you always need the church's authority to guide you. You always need the church's authority to structure your life. And that was a very different message than generations of Christians had learned over that time.
One of the surprising things, and it's interesting when you talk about this kind of battle between your innately corrupted, I'll use the term soul for now, and how you need to act, and you need the state to influence you and the church to keep you on the right path. But that idea of that tension, you make the point that we see this even today, like Western societies become more science-oriented, more secular, but some of those basic assumptions about the innate human nature and where morality comes from have stayed the same. So how do you see those older religious ideas playing out in even social science and behavioral science today?
I see them everywhere. I think that these stories, they're not ostensibly Christian stories. People have removed reference to God and sin and Jesus from them, but they're still in circulation, and they are really shaping how we are making sense of the science, and I think even which science gets conducted in the first place.
So give me an example of where you see it.
So I think if we think about this Pelagian idea of what's nature can't be sinful. It's biological or it's bad. It's one or the other. I think we see a version of that story, of that moral intuition, in lots of places. I think we're living through it right now with Ozempic and weight stigma, obesity, where if you look at the news, any story about we've discovered a drug that is a biological mechanism that can change weight, there will be some paragraph in there that says, and this is evidence that weight is not a matter of willpower, that obesity is not something that's bad or good. And I agree with that conclusion. I don't think it's good or bad to be a certain weight, but not because it's biological. But that's a story in which evidence that something can be manipulated biologically is evidence against the idea that we should see it in terms of morally blameworthy or praiseworthy, or a matter of moral choice, a matter of willpower, that sort of thing.
One place I see this kind of most extreme, I'm sure you read Sapolsky's book, Behave. And it's taken to its extreme. The argument is we have no free will, and so therefore nothing is really moral in the sense that, not that we shouldn't have ways to be good, but that it's not someone's fault.
Yes. I think, so in his most recent book, Determined, Sapolsky says that essentially we should treat someone who does something really morally outrageous, even murder, the way that we would treat a natural disaster. It's as useless to be mad at someone who's committed murder as it is to be mad at the sky for raining. And that, I think Sapolsky is a deeply Pelagian thinker, which is if you've inherited it and it's part of nature, and he's coming from a psychology, primatology background where he can see the evidence of nature in all behavior, then it can't be moral. I think he's on one end of the extreme of our knowledge of nature dissolves morality, that there can be no morality because everything is natural.
And then we also have the flip side of that,
Yes.
which is where there's this assumption and lots of evolutionary explanations I see where we assume human nature is innately selfish and craven.
Yes.
It's only through willpower we can change it. Another question that comes from this, I think, has to do with the fact that behavioral genetics is a field that is inherently fraught in some ways, right? It brings up the big question of nature versus nurture. Are we basically subservient to some part of us, like our genes, that we can't control? Or does a lot of our behavior come from things that we learn and our cultural shaping? And I think a lot of people assume that the debate emerges from all the science that we're learning. But you point out that that framing actually has religious roots too.
Yeah.
How so?
So from a scientific perspective, if you ask anyone working on genetics or child development or psychology, they will all say the nature-nurture debate is dead. It's always nature and nurture. It's always gene-environment interaction. Your DNA is a molecule that sits inside your cells, and something has to happen to it. It has to do something in a cell in order for it to have any effect on behavior. And what is that thing? It is a cellular environment. It is a physical environment. It is a social environment. A lot of people don't even think that it makes scientific sense to talk about nature and nurture as separate things, because if you have an experience, I'm doing research on this in my lab right now, if you're being raised in poverty in Texas, I can look at your epigenome and see how it is that poverty is affecting how your genes are read, which is going to affect you differently depending on which genes you have. Is that nature or nurture? It's both. It's nature-nurture, right? It is the combination of them. And yet this phrase, this alliterative phrase, a born devil on whose nature-nurture could never stick, that's Shakespeare, has such a powerful hold on our imagination. And as an educator, I always find it really interesting. What are the myths that are really easy to dispel? Like you explain it once and people are like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then other ones where it doesn't matter how much you explain it scientifically, there's an intuition, there's a story that's so sticky that's really hard to dislodge it. And I think part of the reason that the nature-nurture debate is so sticky is because we are used to thinking about ourselves and each other as having an essence. There's a real Dave deep down in there, and there's a real Paige that's deep down in there. And in a previous time, we might have used soul or spirit. And that thing might have even, in a Christian conception, predated your existence on this planet, right? That when I was a child, I always thought of a big lineup of souls waiting for God to send them down to earth to inhabit babies. So there's something eternal, something that predates your existence. That was your soul. Except now we live in a secularized culture in which not everyone believes there is a soul. So what do we use as that essence placeholder? What is the thing onto which we ascribe all of those essential characteristics that we used to use as a soul? And that thing in our culture is increasingly DNA. You see this metaphor everywhere. It's in the DNA of X, meaning that thing is essentially X. So I think we have this nature-nurture debate because genetics is a new science. We figured out the structure of DNA 70 years ago. Right? We are one generation away from having no idea what the physical substance of heredity is. That is a radically new idea. Whereas we've had millennia of thought that there's something essentially you that's a through line through your whole life. And then there's what happens to you in your life. And I think we've taken all of those old stories about essentially you and then stuff that's happening to you, and we've grafted that story on to making sense of what geneticists are saying.
So we're going to talk about specifics in a minute, but just so our listeners can get a sense, when we're talking about behaviors that are sinful, or what you and I in our fields might call just harmful behaviors or antisocial behaviors, how do you typically study that as a behavioral geneticist?
Yeah. So let me start with one behavior and then we can expand out there. So I'm a clinical psychologist, most interested in child and adolescent psychology and psychiatry. And psychiatry has a label, a diagnosis for children whose primary problem is that they lie and they cheat and they steal and they break rules. They aggress against other kids. They might torture the family cat. And that label is called conduct disorder. And it's interesting because it's in the DSM. Like if you go to a psychiatrist, you can get that diagnosis the way you would get a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, except that it is defined by behaviors that are breaking rules and violating the rights of other people. So it's things that both sit really close to the heart of what most people think moral and immoral behavior is, right? Most people think it's bad if you're torturing the family cat and not feeling guilty about it. And also it's a symptom. We can put it on a rating scale. We can ask parents, how often does your child feel guilty after they misbehave? What we see from a lot of data, adoption studies, large-scale family-scale studies, is that conduct disorder, another word for it might be antisocial behavior, so behaving in a way that's not good for the social group, tends to run in families with a wide variety of behaviors that are both disinhibited, so we would say doing things without regards to their potential negative consequences to yourself. So if I have sex without a condom with very many people, I'm risking negative health consequences, right? Or behaviors that are what we would say are antagonistic. So that's doing things without regards to their negative consequences for other people, right? So if I steal your wallet, I'm doing something that might benefit me but ignores consequences to you. So what I'm interested in is what are the genes that are more common in people who don't just do one of these things, but who are across the lifespan from childhood to teenage years into adulthood, more likely to behave in ways that are disinhibited and antagonistic. And what's really interesting about that constellation of behaviors is that we can study them scientifically, we can model them in animals, we can look at genes and brain circuits, and they are behaviors that really, about which people have strong moral intuitions.
They underlie a lot of different sins, as we would say.
Yes, exactly. So disinhibition, as a psychologist, we're thinking about there's behaviors, and then what are the dispositions or temperaments or personality traits that underlie many different behaviors. And so when I have my psychologist hat on, I can say what I'm interested in is the development of disinhibition and antagonism in childhood and adolescence. And then when I have my person living in the world hat on, I can see that people who behave in persistently disinhibited and antagonistic ways piss other people off, make other people mad, are violating not just arbitrary social rules, but pretty deeply ingrained moral norms.
I want to pivot in a minute to talk about the implications of some of this. But before I do that, I want to ask you a more philosophical question. You note in your book that Dante's eighth circle of hell was reserved for people who tried to predict someone's future.
Oh, yeah.
The fortune tellers, right? And their punishment was that they had to walk around with their heads twisted backward because their sin was that they tried to look too far into the future. So as you do this work and as you look at someone's genetic sequence, and we'll talk about what those markers are in a minute, but you find that, okay, this person looks like they're going to have problems with antisocial behavior. Is there a warning there for you in this type of work? That is, do you ever worry about telling someone that in the sense that they're going to view their flawed or that it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy for them going forward?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I include that line in there because I do think that Dante has a warning for us in genetics. As a geneticist, we're trying to figure out what causes what, ideally to try to make the world better. Right now, if you have a child and their primary problem is conduct disorder, and you take them to the therapist or the psychiatrist, it isn't like there's antidepressants for conduct disorder. There's no medications that are approved for it. It has one of the lowest response rates to therapy, particularly for the most serious cases where children don't experience prosocial emotions, and people who are engaged in harm in their lives, that's a huge social cost. How much better would it be if we understood the mechanisms of addiction or antisocial behavior and could use that information to better prevent, better intervene, better treat? And at the same time, we risk engendering knowledge that isn't used for good and that could be used for harm. And I think there's a couple of different ways that this could play out. One is what you bring up, which is I tell someone, or I tell someone's parents, this child is at elevated risk for developing a drug addiction. Does that become a self-fulfilling prophecy because now they see themselves or are seen in certain ways? What happens if I tell someone that they're at low risk and they then are very casual about their drug use or alcohol use? They think it's a license to be cavalier about addictive substances. There's risk to telling someone that they're on the low risk end.
That's true. Yeah.
There's also that these are not crystal balls. All of our genetic knowledge is about risks and probabilities. We can say that you're 1.5 times more likely or 2 times more likely, but I can never say this will definitely happen. And when there's uncertainty, people have different tolerances for how much do they want to live in the tension of that uncertainty. And we're seeing this debate play out not just in genetics, but in a lot of areas of science, where what are the dangers of prediction? To what extent are people's freedoms being infringed on because you have the surveillance that can come from prediction? Would we want a company like Palantir to have access to people's genetic information? I think there's a lot of dystopian possibilities that come to mind there.
Is there an easy answer to the question of how much of our behavior, how much of that probability is determined by our genetic endowment?
No, there's not an easy answer because determined is not the right word. It's always in reference to an environment. And then there's what we know is in the general bucket of genetics versus what can be predicted by the genetics that we know enough to be able to measure and understand. The kind of rule of thumb is that most human characteristics are about 50% heritable, which means about half the differences between us are ultimately due to genetic differences between us. Currently, we can predict about 12% of the variance with a measured genetic indicator for a lot of these risk-taking, but 12% is really different than 100%, right? So one kind of metaphor is I can tell you that cities that are at a higher altitude are colder on average. I can't tell you whether or not it's going to be raining in Seattle 3 weeks from now. There's climates, which are averages, and genetics are very much in averages. And then there's specific weather events. And individual human lives are much more about, is it going to be raining in 3 weeks in Seattle? Then on average, do people who have this genetic risk have this higher probability of behavior?
And another area where that kind of statistical reasoning or probability comes in is, I think most people, when they hear about this, think there is a gene for violence or there is a gene for addiction. But that's not exactly how it works, right? So how does it work? So
in very rare cases, there are monogenic disorders, which are single genes where there's a single location in the gene that has a huge, highly penetrant effect on human behavior. So something like Huntington's disease, where you have a mutation in a specific spot and you will get the disease. The vast majority of behaviors and traits that psychologists study and the vast majority of people are not like that. They're what we call massively polygenic, which means that they're influenced by hundreds or thousands of genetic variants. By genetic variant, I mean difference between people in their DNA sequence that are scattered throughout the entire genome. And each one of those things makes a tiny little difference, but collectively, they can make a much bigger difference. So we see this for something like height. Height is a model trait that we use a lot just to make sure the math is working out. If it's not going to work for height, it's not going to work for something much more complicated. And so most of why some people are taller or shorter is not because they have the height gene. It's that they have thousands of variants that make them a 0.5 millimeter taller or shorter. And the distribution of all of those Most people have an average amount of height increasing genes and height decreasing genes. But for some people, those height genes, it's like you flipped a coin and it came up heads 1,000 times in a row, and they end up being 7 feet tall. And that's exactly what we see for addiction, for antisocial behavior, for risk-taking, for personality. There's people on the extremes of a distribution, but the differences between them and everyone else are differences in degree, not in kind. There's not one psychopath gene or one addiction gene that you're going to get.
So even when we understand it that way, even scientists sometimes, I think we fall into this kind of more commonsensical way of thinking about it that leads to some interesting paradoxes. And one paradox is this. Sometimes, if it's something like weight, as you said before, we can make the excuse, oh, it's not that you're gluttonous, to use one of the 7 deadly sins, or have no willpower. It's that you have this genetic issue that makes you more likely to have an eating problem. But other times, if we see someone who has a similarly genetically influenced tendency toward violence, and if they hurt someone, we're less forgiving. Why is that?
I think that's Augustine coming back to us. So there's a great study by Susan Gelman, and a psychologist, and her colleagues, where they look at this, where they ask people to imagine a hypothetical sperm donor. So they say, okay, you're going to conceive a child, and you have conceived a child with a sperm donor, and you find out after you've conceived the child that the sperm donor has a number of these various characteristics. And then they ask them, how likely is the child conceived from the sperm donor to have that characteristic? So it's getting at people's intuitions about how inheritable something is without getting into the specifics of polygenetic or anything like that. And so they say, okay, the sperm donor spoke French. Or is the child going to speak French? Some people think yes, but most people understand genetics well enough to say no. Just because the sperm donor speaks French doesn't mean the child. If the sperm donor is very tall, or has a high body weight, or is an extrovert, or graduated from college, and people differ in their intuitions about how likelihood can this be physically passed down. And then they say the sperm donor committed a violent crime. How likely is the child to commit a violent crime? And again, there's variation, but people on average think that capacity for violence is as inheritable as body weight is, which also fits with our scientific understanding. But then people who have a higher estimate of this father-to-child biological transmission of the capacity for violence, they then ask participants, how harshly should certain crimes be punished? And the more inheritable people think crime is or violence is, the more harshly they want to punish that violent crime. They recommend harsher prison sentences. And you're right, that's opposite to how biological information works when we're talking about weight or sexual orientation or depression, where biological information tends to soften people's judgments of how blameworthy that is. And we even have idioms in the English language. We talk about the bad seed, or bad to the bone, or the natural born killer, right? So there's this idea that something you can inherit can make you not just predispose you to bad behavior, but make you inherently bad. And I think when people switch from my genes made me do it, and therefore it's not my fault, that's kind of a determinist framing. Genes are constraining my agency, to the genes are telling me about how someone truly is, whether they're truly bad. That's this kind of switch from more Pelagian thinking to more Augustinian. You inherited it, couldn't have gone otherwise, and it makes you even more damnable, even more punishable because of it.
So it seems we're seeing echoes of both Pelagian thinking and Augustinian thinking, and it kind of changes depending upon the situation. Do you think, is there something about how we think about free will that affects this? Because I can see people in some instances we're ready to assume free will exists, and in other situations we kind of write it off.
I think it has to do with two things. I think one is, if you're forced to choose between it's bad or biological, if there doesn't seem to be anyone harmed by the behavior, or the only person being harmed is the person doing the behavior itself, then they'll say, okay, it's biological, not bad. But then when it comes to something like violence, There's no getting out of the badness of that, right? That's very close to the heart of what we mean, most people, when they say something's bad, immoral, is deliberately hurting another person. And then we do have another cultural story in the background that we can draw on there. So it's either going to be it's bad and it's not biological, or it's going to be it's bad and, oh, look what we have in our back pocket. We have this other ancient narrative that it's bad and biological, and that makes you more punishable for it. And why are we so reluctant to give up the badness and they're punishable for it? I think that's another thing that's really deeply ingrained in us, which is we are social animals. We evolved for cooperation. And so we are coming into these social relationships with really strongly evolved norms around violations of cooperation, as serious as violence. They have to have consequences to them.
Yeah, we see that in lots of areas. Kirk Gray, the moral psychologist, makes the argument that a lot of morality is really about harm, as you're saying. If I'm harming myself, that's not great. But if I'm harming somebody else, it's a different story. And so do you think it's kind of some of our evolved moral mechanisms, for lack of a better term, are determining when we are assigning blame here?
Yes. Every cooperative species, every cooperative system, even not species, in our evolutionary history shows something that looks like punishment, that looks like a deliberate reaction to a violation of a cooperative norm. If you are looking at colonies of bacteria and one bacterium starts to be a little bit greedy and it's soaking up too much of the minerals in the bacterial soup, the other bacteria will send out chemical messengers to hurt the one that is taking too much resources. If you look at fig trees, so figs are how wasps reproduce. If a fig tree senses that a wasp is being a lazy pollinator, it will shrivel the figs that wasp has laid its eggs in, right? And then we see this in non-human primates. I think Franz Wahl has been amazing in bringing people's attention to the fact that our sins are connected to our animal past, but our morality is connected to our animal past too. We have this incredible evolutionary lineage of evolving cooperation, which means evolving mechanisms for the enforcement of cooperation. And so much of that enforcement looks like punishment. It looks like consequences. So I think this idea that we're just going to see someone deliberately hurting another people and not have a really strong evolved response of, how dare they? They can't get away with that.
But there's even neuroscientific work, right, that suggests that when we see that person punished, we actually at some level enjoy that.
Yeah, or at least we see the neural signatures of dopamine release that we also see when other basic human needs and wants get satisfied. Dopamine is like a motivator, right? It's a saying, yes, that, more of that, please. More sex, more food, more drugs, more alcohol, more punishment. And that's a really interesting clue evolutionarily, because how does evolution, I'm anthropomorphizing evolution, but how does the evolutionary process motivated behavior that's good for survival? Part of the way it's done that is by helping us build a neural architecture that gives us experiences of pleasure when we do things that are good for us and good for the species. So it's good for us to mate, and it's good for us to eat sweet food that's in season and very ripe. And it's good for us to punish wrongdoers. In a small-scale cooperative society, you can't just let people do whatever they want and violate the cooperative norms. I talk in my book about how Augustine advocated that everyone should be celibate and give up sex. And there are some people who can be celibate, but most people find that deeply counter to their human nature. And I think going back to Sapolsky, he's the Augustine of retribution. He's saying everyone should just forswear any sort of punishment impulses, like science has rendered guilt obsolete. And I think that's about as realistic as Augustine saying that everyone should be celibate. I think it's really baked into our human nature, into our human psychology, to want to see violators of cooperative norms, for there to be consequences to that in some way.
So how are we, once we move from our small group living based on how we evolved to larger, more complex societies today.
Yeah.
How do we see these ideas about genetic influences playing out in the legal system regarding punishment?
In the most confused and chaotic way possible. I mean, people don't understand genetics. Lawyers and judges sure as heck don't understand genetics. I mean, even most psychologists don't understand genetics. So what you see is a real haphazard patchwork of people trying well, maybe if we introduce genetics into this court case, maybe it would have the same effect as introducing evidence about the fact that the defendant was abused as a child, right? So defense lawyers usually introduce genetic evidence most often in the sentencing phase. So not around did they do it, but how harshly should they be punished for it? And attempting to introduce it as a mitigating factor. So this person has a specific genetic measurement, or this person has a deep family history, for instance. I talk in my book about one person who was adopted at birth, chronically antisocial and trouble in the law by the time he was a teenager, even before then, committed a murder, was imprisoned, escaped, committed another murder, went back to prison. And one of his fellow inmates recognized him and said, "I know your dad." And he goes, "Well, I don't know my dad. I was adopted." And he goes, "No, I know your biological dad. I was in prison with him." And it turns out that his biological father was also on death row in another state for also committing another murder. And so he asked the Supreme Court eventually, I was adopted and my own father was in prison. My grandfather committed murder. Isn't this evidence that I inherited some biological liability? And at every point, the court was like, we don't buy it. And even if we did buy it, that would just make you more punishable because it means that you're truly bad to the bone. So he was executed by the state at the end of the day, too. So even though there is one intuition that says, I didn't have any control over my genetics and maybe it shaped me, maybe my genes made me do it, on average, it has failed to make judges and jurors more sympathetic. It's failed to be mitigating. And if anything, it tends to perhaps make them more punitive.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's about recidivism. I think it's about if it's genetic, it can't be changed. I think we're back to this essence, this soul. And no, that's not true. You and I are both wearing eyeglasses. That's genetic, and we change it all the time. There's no relationship between how genetic something is and how changeable something is. But since genetics has been grafted onto what we used to ask from the concept of a soul, we tend to think of things that are genetic as really enduring and unchangeable. So if you think of someone as truly bad and can never be reformed, why would you ever let them out of prison? We need to be protected from them. So it dials up the harshness, I think.
That is really interesting. We've been talking about how this relates to punishment in society and our views of laws and morality. But lots of times we reserve sometimes our harshest moral judgments for ourselves. And so I'm wondering, how do you see this playing out on an individual level when we try to look at our own moral failings?
Yeah. So I think a lot of times societally, when we're talking about the criminal justice system, criminal legal system, in our relationships with other people, in our intimate relationships, in our parenting, and then in particularly with ourselves, we can mistake blame and accountability. We can collapse those two concepts. So blame is, you did this, it was bad, you're bad, you deserve to be punished. Whereas accountability is, you did this, there needs to be consequences or changes. Clearly something's not working because you violated this norm. How do we hold you accountable so that our relationships can be repaired in the future moving forward? A lot of times when we're in the blame mindset, and then someone brings in science, whether that be the science of childhood trauma, whether that be the science of genetics or epigenetics, we can try to use it as a kind of a get out of jail free card for blame, but it tends to not fully dissolve the consequences of that harm. So the philosopher Hannah Picard talks about this as the rescue blame trap. And I think we do this in society where we say they did this horrible thing, but they were abused as a child. But yes, they did this horrible thing. And I think we do that with ourselves, where we blame ourselves harshly. We remember all the reasons why we did it, what we were thinking at the time, all the ways that other people have hurt us. But yes, we did this horrible thing. And we're in this vacillation, this stance of the rescue blame trap. I think some part of that is just being human. There's no easy solution to that. But for me, the way forward goes back to remembering blame is not accountability, and accountability doesn't always depend on blame and shame. So there can be this very backwards looking, like, this is what I did, and I feel so guilty about it. I feel so much shame about it. And also I can think about all the reasons why I did it, and do all those reasons why I did it add up to enough to forgive myself, versus what do I need to do today and tomorrow for this to not happen again, for me to repair those relationships, for me to communicate to the people that I've hurt that I understand that I hurt them. And ironically, so often blame gets in the way of accountability. Like if you're so busy beating yourself up, you can't even begin to take accountability.
One of those relationships, I'm going to ask you to think back to when you were a person of faith.
Yeah.
For people of faith, one of those important relationships is with God, right? And so how do you make sense of this? Because if you tell me that I have some genetic marker that makes me more likely to sin, to commit violence, to engage in risky sex, to become an addict, in some ways, isn't that like God setting me up to fail? And why would God do that?
Yeah. And I think this is part of that kind of idea that maybe God set me up to fail. That predates genetics, right? That's Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says maybe some of us were made to be vessels of wrath. And he's really struggling with that question of if there's divine providence, but then there's also punishment. How could this be? That's Calvin's doctrine of double election, right? Of some people have been predestined before the dawn of time for heaven and for hell. And that question of if there's a loving creator, how could I have been created in a way that is going to predestine me to eternal damnation? And I think that's part of why genetics can haunt people, is because it can seem at first to echo these older stories that people tell about God. I don't believe in hell anymore, or I don't believe in an eternal lake of fire anymore. I think of hell as disconnection, and people can create their own hell on this earth when they're disconnected from other people. And I also don't think that anyone has been created to fail or been created to be damnable. So that's the result of me wrestling with my own faith. I think people will have to wrestle with how they make sense of that theology.
And I wonder if there are alternative framings that can be used. So one of my favorite framings here comes from Islam, the Hadith, which is a teaching of the Prophet Muhammad. And I probably don't have the wording right, but I'm going to read this. It's basically like this. It's the most tested of all people are the prophets of God. And then next are the righteous, the people who are most beloved by God. And so that teaching basically says those who are the most righteous, who God loves the most, are the ones he's giving the test to make it the hardest. And so I'm wondering if there are ways to kind of reframe that in sacred texts, in religious teachings.
You do see that echoes of that in Christian scripture too, count it all joy, or that Paul talking about how I have a thorn in my side, and that the process of wrestling with that has been a spiritual gift. As a clinician, what that makes me think of is what it's like to be around people who are in active recovery from substance use disorders, and how many of them really do this balance of, again, I could just be in a blame-shame spiral, but that doesn't help me with my addiction. What helps me with my addiction is structuring my life such that I'm accountable to myself and other people. So they're moving towards accountability away from blame. But also sometimes if you ask them, if you could wave a magic wand and have never gone through this experience, they wouldn't necessarily take it away, because it has engendered a deep compassion for their humanity, their creatureliness, and for other people's. And there's a spiritual genius to that I think is very difficult to arrive at that spot if life has been smooth sailing.
And there's also in those programs usually an element of surrender to a higher power. So recognition that we are all fallible, but that's part of the plan and God's going to help me, right?
Yes. I mean, in that sense of I am powerless before a substance and I am surrendering to a higher power and I'm atoning and I'm asking for accountability and I'm committing to make today different. I find that so much more satisfying than so much of the academic philosophy on free will, because it's a both and. It's a, I am powerless and I'm accountable. It's not my fault and it's my responsibility.
Yeah, it doesn't mean just giving in. It means trying to do your best, but realizing you are insufficient and you need help, and that's okay.
Yeah. So there was this book called Success and Luck, maybe 6 years
by
ago.
Bob Frank.
Yes, which I think is a great book. And, this is not about anything, not about addiction, not about any of the things we're talking about, but just he talks about how when he's looking back in his life, he focuses on the role of luck. And then when he's looking forward in his life, he focuses on the role of agency. And that's always stuck with me as we don't have to choose between luck and agency, whether that's genetic luck or environmental luck or agency or freedom or responsibility. We can actually hold both. And many of the most wonderful people to be around are extremely agentic with regards to how they're facing tomorrow and extremely self-compassionate and generous about the role of luck when making sense of their successes in the past. And I think that's a really beautiful way to live.
So we've talked about how when we're struggling with our own views of our failings, looking forward at what's to come and what we can do and the changes we can make versus looking backward at the sins, the antisocial behaviors, the moral failings that we've had and struggling with that. Can we take that same time lens and think about what that means at a societal level for how we deal with moral failings?
I think so. And I think taking that forward-looking view would actually be a really positive development for especially our criminal legal system. So if we're thinking about what is punishment for? Like, what are we hoping to do when we punish someone, when we convict a murderer of murder and put them in jail? And people have talked about a couple of different functions for punishment. And one is just retribution. Just the point is to make the person suffer. You did something bad, and so you deserve to hurt on the basis of that. But that's not the only function of punishment. We can also think about rehabilitation. If we impose a consequence, can we change your likelihood of doing this in the future? Can we change your future behavior? Can we change other people's future behavior? So this is the kind of deterrent effect of punishment. If you see that people get away with murder scot-free, are you more likely to murder someone yourself? And then there's also just incapacitation, which is how do we keep everyone safe from someone who wants to harm them or could harm them? Right now, the U.S. legal system is incredibly retributive. And we do it under this idea that wrongdoers deserve to suffer. And as a result, we're not paying really any attention to any of the forward-looking consequences of punishment. We have one of the highest recidivism rates in the world, where people who are punished are more likely to reoffend, probably because we've traumatized them and reduced any opportunities of them to repair their relationships with society and for society to repair their relationships with them. So I think the same thing that people do with themselves, which is how do I recognize that what I did is wrong, have compassion for all the ways that behavior was shaped by things not under my control, and then given where I am today, what is the best way forward to repair my relationships with other people and make it so that I don't do that again? I think we can take those same principles and think about how they would apply to our criminal legal punishment. And I think we would have a dramatically different system if we did that.
But I want to ask you, is there any evidence that speaks to how well that would work? Because one of the points you raised is that the people who have the riskiest genetic inheritance are often raised in the environments that make those antisocial behaviors more likely to become manifest. So do we have any good evidence that if we make those changes that you're saying, how mutable those behaviors are, even within the person going forward?
So I would say that my prior is that people can change. And there's going to be exceptions to this, but what we know from looking at the human life course is that people are capable of a wide variety of behaviors. And even our genotypes, I think what our genotypes do is give us a lot of plasticity in responses to our environments. And we don't have to imagine utopias. We can look even at other countries, Norwegian prison systems, where the maximum sentence is 21 years. They spend 3 times as much per prisoner to incarcerate someone as we do in the United States, but they have vanishing less crime and people are much less likely to reoffend. And part of what makes that system different is it's really focused on, again, this forward conception of what do we need to do in order for this person to change, not how do we figure out how much this person deserves to suffer.
Do you think that some of the wisdom from religion can play in here? And by that, I mean, if you look at the epidemiological data, the benefits of religion, most of them don't come from saying, I believe in God. They come from engaging in certain practices, building community, engaging in meditation, which helps us sit with negative emotion as opposed to react to them. So do you think there's something in the traditions focusing on the practices of building community or of curating your emotional life of gratitude and compassion and empathy that can play a role in modulating behavior too?
So if we look at prison systems or punishment systems that are just really different from the United States, I think Norway is an interesting counterpoint because it's also a Christian country. It's coming from the same general religious tradition that the United States is. And Norwegians are just as likely as Americans to say they believe in free will. So it's not a people don't have control over what they do. It's not a kind of argument from determinism. What they don't believe in, again, is hell. They're much less likely than Americans to believe in hell. So there's something about this belief that what justice is suffering and maximum suffering that seems to be really different between countries. And I do think that there's a possibility that shapes then how do we approach justice on this earth, right? Our conceptions of what divine justice is are going to shape our conceptions of what justice between people are. And so if you think there is a God, that God has given us some free will and agency, but no one is going to be punished forever, no one deserves to be tormented forever, I think that vision of the afterlife can reverberate on earth.
Yeah, I think, we had a writer on a few seasons ago, Elizabeth Oldfield, and she talked about the way that we think about sin and how we should reconceptualize it. And one point she made is that if we think things are biologically determined, if you're inherently flawed, well, either we're going to punish you or we might not blame you then. But that removes the opportunity in some ways for us to engage in forgiveness and for us to repair those relationships, because either it's not your fault, you can't help it, or you're inherently sinful, we can't change that. And so I always think about the idea from Buddhism, which is you can always begin again. And part of that is forgiveness. And so how do we move beyond this idea of either being inherently flawed or it's not your fault? How do we find that balance?
Yeah. I like that kind of reconception of sin. And also that sin is an opportunity to repair and harm is an opportunity to find forgiveness. We use this phrase in English a lot when we're talking about whether or not someone's guilty or to blame. We say, are they going to be on the hook? And the mental image of on the hook is like some sort of torturer's hook, right? That you're pierced and you're being hovered over the lake of fire, or that you're a fish wriggling on the end of a hook. You're in a tortured state when you're on the hook. And in my book, I think about what are different metaphors for hooks. I'm a sewer. I like to knit, embroider. And if you think about crochet hooks, what are they doing? They're hooking threads, but they're doing that to bring them back together. You can weave a collective, a fabric, but you need a hook in order to bring that wayward thread back into the circle. And just thinking about switching up my metaphor for hooks, right? What does it mean for someone to be on the hook? I don't think it should mean we're dangling them over a lake of fire. I think it should mean we as a society who are weaving this cooperative piece together are bringing that thread back into the fold, into the weave. And fabric that's been ripped and rewoven is often stronger than one that's never been ripped in the first place.
A hook that tears, or a hook that mends. It's a small shift in how we think about what it means to be on the hook for our mistakes. But as Paige suggests, it points to something much bigger, a fundamentally different vision of what justice and repair could look like, for ourselves and for each other. Because science hasn't made the idea of sin obsolete, but it is challenging us to think about it differently. There's no disputing that genetic endowments make it harder for some people to avoid things like addiction or aggression. But the flip side is that genetics also make it easier for some people to be kinder and calmer. So should they get less credit for being good? I think a better way to look at it is that just as we're all born into different situations that can complicate our paths through life, our genes are simply one more part of that story, one more factor that predisposes us toward vice or virtue. But when those predispositions lead to acts that hurt other people, the consequences are greater. And that raises the question of what kind of society we want to be. One that favors redemption or retribution. Religions in general, and Christianity in particular, have debated the issue for centuries. Is God all forgiving, or does fire and brimstone await the sinner? While there's no easy answer, here on Earth at least, we have the power to decide. Next time on How God Works, we're talking to Robbie Hoffman, the 36-year-old rising comedy star with a recent sold-out tour, Netflix special, and Emmy nomination, about what exactly makes Jews good at being funny.
There's a je ne sais quoi to it. There's something to it. There's a special sauce.
We'll hear how humor has defined and helped the Jewish people and her personally through difficult times. And ask, can laughing itself be a spiritual practice?
I think it'd be really fun if I got together a mega synagogue. I'm the Rav, I'm the rabbi, and I'm doing comedy. And listen, my sermons, they're a little off color, okay? But what a sermon. What a sermon.
How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Sophie Eisenberg and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producers are Emmanuel Desarme and Cleo Levin. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Our fact checker is Natsumi Ajisaka. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks.org. And for episode shorts, extras, and my ruminations on science and spirituality, check us out on Instagram at howgodworkspod. And you can also see all of our episodes along with special bonus show material on our YouTube page at howgodworkspod.